next program this morning is the Open University.
Twirl around, shiny wet clay. Firm hands will shape it and make it a bowl for your roses. Twirl around, twirl around.
Hello again. This is your host for the Open University, Nicholas John Curry, and I should probably tell you that this week I have a new book out, which is my autobiography, my memoir. Sorry, I'm being all Miss Jean Brodie. I don't know where that came from. Momus Niche is out this week, available from Farrar, Straus and Giroux, published in America only, although it's available from various online platforms and things, the usual suspects. And it's worth a read. It's getting rave reviews. My big ambition for it was to get into the New Yorker, to get reviewed in the New Yorker, but apparently that's not easy to do at all for this kind of book. And so far, silence from the New Yorker. I'll feel I've arrived really when I get reviewed in the New Yorker. I mean, they've already reviewed my live, or previewed my live shows and things. I think they said something about he's a bit like Rabelais with a side order of Boccaccio, which I rather liked. I would hope they would say the same kind of thing about Niche. But I wanted to ramble, since it's my habit really to ramble. You know, stuff is always going through one's head, and one is wearing, this is a new jacket one bought at Humana. I was there 2 days ago with a young friend from Potsdam who's a musician, a guitarist in a band. He calls himself Kinski. What is it? Something Kinski. Gonzo Kinski is his stage name. And he was. I said, I'll style you. Let's go down to Humana and I'll buy you some jackets and sort of stage clothes and things, and I'll kind of style you, because, you know, I kind of enjoy doing that with people. I take them to Humana and I sort of remake them in my own image of what they should look like. So in his case, it was plaids, but I tried to get him away from his color palette of kind of greys and greeny olive and beige into more pink. And this is what I like about this. It's a sort of plaid. It's a pink. It's actually an Italian jacket from, I think, the 60s or 70s, but it's such a subtle pink and grey twill that it really has a very it could really be a pink jacket, but it's not. It's a sensible woolen jacket, which is verging on pinkness, and I kind of like that. And this is also the kind of, it looks a bit like a football strip, but it's actually a rather frilly collared women's top, which I also got at Humana. And the trousers, of course, are not Nazi. I walk around Berlin wearing this kind of trouser design, and people look at it rather suspiciously, as if I'm wearing Nazi trousers, because they kind of have this knickerbocker look to them. But of course, they're not. They're Japanese carpenter trousers, and the Japanese were inspired by Scottish golf trousers. Nikazubon is what the Japanese call this shape of trouser. And just the fact that that Hugo Boss designed these Nazi outfits, you know, that happen to have had the same shape, does not tarnish our Scottish golf trousers forever. And that kind of verges on what I want to talk about today, whether ideologies tarnish certain ways of thinking about things, or certainly put them out of fashion for a while, or associate them with the right, or whichever faction you disagree with seems to own an idea. And a lot of political affiliation is, oh gosh, it's not about reaching logical conclusions on individual issues. It's about, what is the cluster of values that my tribe believes in? And a lot of very confused thinking comes about as a result of this. For instance, the idea that, is it a left-wing position to say one is born this way, you know, born gay or whatever it is? Lady Gaga presumably meant gay, I think, when she used that title, Born This Way. Or is it a left-wing, a more interesting left-wing position to say, I've really chosen to be this way, chosen to be gay, and that was totally my individual choice. The trouble is that if you make it a choice, there are certain political organizations which will mobilize against the possibility of making that choice. So in the 80s, our political process in Britain, Thatcherism, tried to penalize the choice. They said it was a choice to become homosexual, and that militant gays in schools and libraries and other publicly funded places were promulgating the idea that it was a valid choice to become gay. And of course, at the time, AIDS was rampant, and so there was a feeling of discomfort about this. Apart from the widespread prejudice against gayness, there was this sense that it was a medical danger as well. So they passed legislation to prevent the funding of the promotion of homosexual lifestyles as if they were normal. And the response to this from the gay community was to start saying, well, it's not a choice, it's actually, you're born this way. So that became the kind of official position. Being born, we live in an individualistic culture, especially in the West, and I often talk about this difference between the East and the West, but we like to think we're in charge. The rational subject, the Cartesian subject who is making conscious and rational decisions about everything in his or her life. But of course it's not that way. And one of the interesting things about getting older is that you begin to sort of take a slightly different view on the nature and nurture debate. Nature and nurture, obviously both play a role in who we are, how we think about things, how we act. Free will and determinism, all the big questions, good God. But you start to see just little things. You start to recognize intuitively that certain bone structures and certain faces, and here we get into dangerous territory because, of course, the Nazis were interested in eugenics, but also phrenology. Eugenics, the planning of the improvement of the human race by interbreeding, as we do with dogs and things, and animals in general. We're quite happy to breed animals to be specifically have certain qualities, but not humans. We don't think that's fair or sensible, but the Nazis did think it was fair and sensible. And also they very much believed in racial purity and the measurement of skulls in order to determine racial characteristics and therefore determine one's status in their projected ideal society, which thank God they never were able to build. That does not mean that any kind of measurement, any kind of phrenology even, is inherently suspect. There is nothing wrong. And I've talked again before in these talks about how the left is it sort of claims to be celebrating diversity all the time, but actually it's very uneasy about the measurement of diversity. If you actually get down to the nitty-gritty of what makes people different, the left or liberal thinking will tend to rush to ideas of universals, what we all have in common, or what or class theory, what classes have in common with themselves, what common interests and things. They don't want to talk about the measurement of actual differences in the world because that's A, divisive, and B, it sort of seems to refer to an idea of there being inherent and even justifiable inequalities in the world. And of course, left thinking doesn't like that idea at all. Of course, equal but different is a good formula, a good response to that. Equal but different, but there is anxiety around difference, and especially the measurement, the quantification of difference, in case it's misused, as it was misused by the Nazis, as it was misused by Thatcher and her government against gay people. So generally, people don't like to portray things like being gay or having changed one's gender, for instance, as a conscious decision or an arbitrary decision or a choice. They prefer to see it that one is simply born somehow into the wrong sex, and then I'm not even going to venture in. I've so-called dead naming and all the rest of it. I've actually gone through the legal system in America with all this stuff and can't really talk about it for legal reasons, the specifics of it. But I do find it interesting that people who might seem to be well served by the idea that it's okay to make a choice of, for instance, one's gender, or not of one's race, though. That's the interesting problem, that all this stuff about trans women are women, which we've been hearing in relation to J.K. Rowling recently, kind of falls flat when you say, well, gosh, if I decide to be black, then I am black. It doesn't seem to work that way. So, and we also have the problem that essentialisms of race and of gender and all the rest of it are very much alive. If you even have to say the phrase trans women are women, you're depending entirely on an essentialism of gender, saying that women women and men are different things, and it's not a social construct and all the rest of it. And there has been a tendency, I think the confusion reigns in these topics in general, but there has been a tendency to claim legitimacy, naturalness, and inevitability, and normalcy above all for the minority groups which came to prominence, came to the world's attention with black rights, civil rights in the 60s, and women's rights, going back to the suffragettes and all the rest of it. But they, one by one, these groups of Jews, women, gays, blacks, minority groups, so-called, although they might, in the case of women, might well be a majority statistically, have wanted to claim naturalness and a kind of mainstream legitimacy, rather than gays saying, we are flamboyant gay people, we can wear, swishy clothes, and a certain sort of sissy idea of gayness disappeared, and a kind of macho idea of gayness replaced it. In terms of what gay men desire in other gay men, they wanted traditionally male-looking, ripped kind of guys with moustaches, and that sort of late Freddie Mercury look took precedence over the early Freddie Mercury look of long hair and nail varnish and all the rest of it. I would say, arguably, because our society values maleness, and rather than dismantle the patriarchy, the gay movement simply capitulated to it, capitulated to those values. So there is this sort of sense that progress forward for the gay movement has been to allow things like gay marriage, and to say, hey, we can adopt children, we're just like you straight people. We don't have any alternative culture to propose to you. There's nothing you can learn from us as a specific culture. The languages, the distinctive languages they had, for instance, like Polare, to evade the scrutiny of a straight world which didn't understand them and would persecute them if it did understand them, disappeared. And there was this, they were replaced from, I guess, the 80s onwards by a sense that, hey, don't bully us because we're just like you. We want to be married. We want to live in a suburban house with our 2 whatever it is kids, which we adopt because we can't actually produce kids. But there was this sort of idea of hiding in plain sight, that we are different, but our difference should be allowed to coexist with your normalcy. We don't challenge your normalcy. What we do is we try to apply for it. We join at the back of the queue, basically, because the problem with this ideology is that, women just have to become surrogate men, or gays become surrogate straight people. You're going to join at the back of the queue. You basically no longer have anything to propose of your own culture. I wasn't meaning to take this diversion. I actually wanted to talk about jaw structure, because I was looking on Twitter today, and my cousin Justin tweeted something. He's been tweeting from his isolation, reviews of albums in which he uses the letters of the word isolation to review the album. So he reviewed this morning an Undertones record with the phrase, it's so overwhelmingly loud and totally incredible on now. And that, of course, spells out isolation. And one of the Undertones, Mikey, the bass player, Michael Bradley from the Undertones, responded saying, "Oh wow, this is high praise indeed from you, Justin." And from a cousin of Momus, no less. So the Undertones, weirdly enough, are Momus fans, or at least the bass player is a Momus fan. And that set me off looking at Undertones. I started looking at the solo career of Fergal Sharkey, and watched some awful 80s videos where he'd made tracks with Joe Callis of the Human League, big synthy tracks, sort of sounding a bit like the Chariots of Fire soundtrack, But the really startling thing about Fergal Sharkey, who's now a high-ranking official, I think, in PRS, or one of the music rights organizations, is that, first of all, if you image Google him, you see pictures of him sort of clasping John Peel's head. John Peel, of course, famously loved Teenage Kicks by the Undertones more than any other record. I was trying to substitute myself, I who had never been accepted by John Peel, trying to think, what if you photoshopped me into that picture, clasping John Peel's head? He'd probably call the police, But because he loved the Undertones, he loved... And it began to strike me that, gosh, there is a certain kind of phrenology that John Peel liked. not accusing him of any fascism, of course, but there was certain racial types that John Peel liked, and I would call them Picts. I don't even know if that's an accurate tribal term to call them. Britain, of course, the United Kingdom, as we're supposed to call it now, it's very shortly going to be a divided kingdom, was originally settled by tribes, the Picts, the Scots, the Celts, the Angles. It's a lot of little tribes who are all ethnically and genetically quite different from each other. And I think as you get older, you begin to recognize certain features and say, oh, that's a Pict, So I may be totally wrong. I mean, I haven't made any scientific study of this, but just intuitively, I group a bunch of people together. I think I look at Donovan, I look at George Mackay Brown, the Orcadian poet, I look at Morrissey, and I look at Fergal Sharkey, and I see something they all have in common, just in terms of their skull and their jaw structures and things like that. And they have this overhanging kind of brow, slightly Cro-Magnon brow, which can look in certain Morrissey photographs, like I think is it Kill Uncle, it's casting shadow over his eyes, and it looks very, very heavy. George Mackay Brown had the same. And then they have these little kind of snub noses, often very small. Fergal Sharkey's nose is tiny. It looks a bit like Michael Jackson's nose that's been honed away down to this little kind of prong in the middle of his face. But then they have these really big lantern jaws. And, there are pictures, again, if I were busy with the Photoshop, I could actually Photoshop Morrissey's hairstyle onto certain pictures of George Mackay Brown and say, this is the same, this is the same kind of genetic ancestry. And I actually downloaded George Mackay Brown's autobiography on Kindle, and it's called I Sing the Islands. It's interesting that sing your life, I sing the islands. The Pictish character is for the islands I sing. It's actually called. The Orkney Islands lie to the north of Scotland, sundered by what is often a stormy piece of water, the Pentland Firth. The tides huddle herds long, the Atlantic pouring into the North Sea into Atlantic 4 times a day. If there are contrary winds, tremendous seas can build up. He was still alive in the 1990s, and yet he writes about, and he writes like, a sort of a timeless ancient author, concerned with timeless ancient topics, and using this archaic language, often words which you'll have to look up because they're so abstruse. And when I googled what people on blogs and things were saying about George Mackay Brown, a lot of attention was being paid to his chin, and some people being very unflattering and saying, well, at least he wasn't a fashion model, But I think he has a fascinating face, and I think I do lump it in with people like Donovan and Morrissey and Marquis Smith as well. I think one reason John Peel liked Marquis Smith is that there's a certain kind of look that these people have very thin lips. Fergal Sharkey has a tiny, tiny little mouth with almost no lips at all, and these very big, very pale, soulful eyes, a kind of Celtic soulfulness. I don't know if Celts and Picts, I don't really know what the connection is. I haven't researched it. I have had my own ancestry traced this year using one of these saliva tests, and it was very accurately pinpointing my genetic roots to Argyll and the islands of the Inner Hebrides, specifically Mull. It had a little circle around, the island of Mull, which is, I know, where we do come from on my mother's side. So it was actually able to pinpoint me, and as I said before, talking about Noemi's DNA test, which she also did, she had an amazing variety coming from mixed Vietnamese and Gypsy stock. She'd been her ancestors had been all across from Central Asia, Far East, and Europe, and the Balkans, and all this different genetic information in there. And mine was really very pure, inverted commas, ethnically pure, which I find embarrassing. I mean, I would much rather be an interesting cocktail genetically. But it is curious when you see that, although we live in a multicultural society and are embracing diversity, it's interesting to think of the fact that there might be a kind of a non-personal influence on your life which is coming up, pushing up through your genes, and will continue in your descendants if you have any, and which will kind of determine, which will be puppeting their lives. It's an anti-individualistic, a more deterministic point of view, more nature as opposed to nurture, it sort of suggests that we are not that much in control of our own destinies, that our destiny will kind of spring up. Something in us is springing up. And this is, when composers, songwriters or authors or whatever talk about where it comes from, the muse or the source of their inspiration, often they will say, well, it just seems to appear. It just seems to come from nowhere. I don't know where this gift comes from, this gift of singing, whatever it is. I think the Irish, obviously, if you look at the Irish contribution to British pop music, for instance, it's almost everywhere. The deeper you look into the genetic sources of, Elvis Costello, John Lydon, David Bowie, Morrissey, all these people who are meant to be English singers tend to be Irish if you scratch a little below the surface. Genetically, they're Irish. I'm 1/8 Irish from one great-grandparent. But obviously before that, there's Irish. There's a lot of Irish, and there's a lot of interchange between Irish and Scottish populations as well. A lot of island hopping between the north of Ireland and Scotland. We also have some DNA from Shetland, apparently. And therefore, you'd think if you go far enough back from Scandinavia, I just read last week that the population of Iceland is almost entirely descended from Scandinavian men, but actually, I think British women, was it Irish and British women who'd been captured by the Vikings and taken to Iceland. So they have this weird mixture of British and Scandinavian, but all the women were sort of British, what we'd now call British, and all the men were these Vikings. Because the men set off, in their long ships. They didn't have women with them. They had to find the women at their destination and carry them on to the next destination. So it was this weird kind of genetic experiment, if you like. And so the population of Iceland is the result of that experiment. But it's just interesting in terms of all our kind of cherished notions of individualism and personal choice. And I'm certainly not against those, That is the nurture. Well, there's nurture, there's nature, and there's character, I suppose you'd have to say. There's this third dimension whereby we set all the store on, in terms of, ideas about who we are. We set a lot of store by this third element of character. Somehow we've been formed by our experiences and all, but we're consciously, in charge. I think that's probably just the tip of the iceberg. I think there's probably a huge underwater component of who we are. I mean, I think of David Bowie as well. If you look at David Bowie, it's really fascinating to look at some pictures he looks like his mother. You can see the sort of very archaic, I think of it as a very archaic brow structure from his mother. So when he plucks his eyebrows, for instance, you can really see his mother's bone structure around the eyes. His mother was quite ugly and severe-looking woman, thin-lipped, with this amazing hairline. He also got his hairline, very, very straight hairline here across the top of the temples, which looked great when he flicked it back. The whole thin white duke look is kind of him showing off his mother's hairline. But also he could look like his father very much as well. His father had a certain squareness of jaw and a sort of athlete's figure, quite small, diminutive, but like a dancer or an athlete, a runner, a long-distance runner or something. These rather square shoulders, which, again, he emphasized by wearing padded shoulders in the mid-70s. But this physical, like a bantam fighter kind of physique. But I think it's really interesting looking at Bowie's lips, which are really perhaps his most unique feature. Not very commented, because people usually talk about the differently coloured eyes and all the rest of it, which was not a genetic thing, obviously, a result of this being punched by George Underwood. But the lips have this fetal quality, as if they're sort of something worm-like and very perfect. He's a very high textural ectomorph, as William Sheldon would put it. Very good quality skin, very soft, smooth skin. I have the same kind of very, very smooth skin. I am also a high textural ectomorph. Very, for my age, I still have very soft skin. But his lips, Bowie's lips, very, very finely wrought, very with the sort of line pattern on them, and they kind of look to me like something that's just been hatched in the womb, like fetal lips. So I always think Bowie can look like a fetus. He looks like a stranger, and this is part of the reason people think of him as extraterrestrials, in the sense that every fetus is from space. You know, we are ultimately derived from exploding cosmic carbon, and in the womb we go through all these stages of non-human evolution. We have gills, we have tails. You know, we actually, ontogeny repeats phylogeny, as the biologists say. So the actual development of an individual in the womb goes through a kind of recaps all the stages that our tribal, our species went through in its evolution. So you go through, you're a fish at one point. You're a tadpole. You're a sperm. You're a fish. You're a little sheep. You're a monkey. You're all sorts of weird things. And somehow Bowie's mouth, to me, it really seems to sum up the strangeness, or the fetal quality that he could sometimes have, this kind of luminosity of his skin, very evident in The Man Who Fell to Earth. And I think a key reason that he was chosen for that role is that there was something otherworldly about his pallor and the fineness of his features, these very long nostrils, this very wide, thin mouth, which got thinner as he got older. So by the time he was an old man, he began to have something saurian, something tortoise-like about him. There is this sort of this physical type often ages into a kind of reptilian look. William Burroughs being the classic example. No coincidence that there was this strong affinity between Burroughs and Bowie, and also Beckett, I think. Beckett, of course, making that Irish connection again. So I think there is often something very, very extraterrestrial about Irish people, that they have this pallor which is almost aggressive whiteness, and they have these very, very thin lips often, and very, very striking eyes, very, very pale, icy, sea-coloured eyes, sort of pale. I'm sure Bernard Albrecht from New Order as well, there's a certain kind of pallor in his eyes, and there's an imagery of coldness and translucency, if you like, in a lot of New Order lyrics as well. So it really begs the question, are we simply expressing, without knowing it, are we the mouthpieces for our genetic material, for our ancient racial memories? And it's a recurring trope in fiction that you find a portrait in the grand baronial hall of an ancestor, and he looks exactly like. Of course, it is a painting of the actor who's playing the part of the current lord, whatever, or baron, whoever. The baronial portrait is his spitting image, and of course there are conspiracy theories saying that there are reptiles who never die, who live for hundreds of years, who are still around. If you look at photographs of what Prince Philip looks like now, he absolutely looks like a sort of grotesque eternal reptile. Of course, having said that, he'll probably die next week, and I'll be proved wrong. But he kind of does look now more and more like an absolutely a hideous gargoyle, as I think that's a phrase he used of the Chinese government at one point. But now he is hideous old waxwork and a gargoyle himself. So I don't know. It's just what's running through my head just now. I'm always fascinated when you notice something like this, which is, it's not on anyone's political agenda to say that our genes speak us. They don't just speak through us, but they might be speaking us. They might be that the totality of things you do are kind of predetermined, pre-programmed, genetically, biologically, and your illusion of choice is just that. It's just an illusion. And what's interesting then is that, if you have children and they have children, if you could come back 3 or 4 generations into the future, if there's still a planet that's habitable, you would look and you would see that people are using the media of that time to express kind of the same things, but in different forms. So, I already feel like my nephews and nieces couldn't read my book, for instance. This is already an artifact of a vanished civilization, which there are still people my age who read this. And Tosh Berman did a kind of podcast the other day about it, and said that he felt that he'd written this book himself because he is of the same generation and has a lot of the same cultural references and connections to Japan and all the rest of it. But obviously that is a generational thing, and one wonders whether people, I don't know, but now I'm contradicting my argument really, because I'm saying that people with the same genes as me, i.e. my nephew and niece and people, won't be able to find anything in this. My genetic heritage will not actually speak to them as loudly as the cultural stuff that I'm discussing in this. This is probably because of the approach I've taken in this, to look at culture and to speak through dead authors' voices. So obviously it's my lifespan since the 1960s that's determining which authors I choose and which kind of, with a kind of time lag, because obviously most of the 20th century writers who have to be dead by the time I use their voices. Culture tends to work with a time lag anyway, because my education in Aberdeen University was definitely out of date. It wasn't a trendy university, it was very traditional. It's one of the first universities founded in Britain and in Scotland. I think founded in the 12th, 13th century, sometime like that. So it's kind of almost as old as Oxford and Cambridge, if not older. And the agenda that I followed was very much influenced by texts from the 50s and 60s. So like last week, what I was talking to you about was the presentation of Self and Everyday Life, which is a book which came out in Scotland in 1956. That's the kind of thing that I'm imbued with, this mid-20th century culture, because of this time lapse that, that was 20 years before I was reading it, published 20 years before I was reading it, so it had had time to filter through culture and to influence, the sociology department at Aberdeen University. I think this is quite valuable, the fact that I'm quite retro in a lot of my references. Obviously I buy secondhand paperbacks, and I like to be out of kilter with contemporary thought, because contemporary thought is it's a kind of awful conformity and awful everyone singing from the same hymn sheet, Twitter, whatever. I really get sick of. I think it's very useful to step aside from that and look at how these questions were thought of in different times. Even if we think of people who have a naive idea of progression, historical and ideological progression, think things are getting better all the time and we're heading towards a liberal utopia. I absolutely don't believe that. I think there are simply an infinitely large number of different perspectives on the same topic, or different framings of the same question, and that it's useful to step aside from the dogmas of the day. And that's what I try to do in these talks. That's just what's been running through my head. Phrenology, Fogel-Sharkey's jaw structure, my jaw structure, which I don't know if I am one of those Pictish people myself. Definitely a Celt. Whenever I hear about the Celts, I think, yeah, I'm definitely one of those. I'm a Celt. I sing easily. I'm inspired all the time. I'm a bit like the Getafix in the Asterix books. I can pick up my lyre, at any moment and start singing. Whether people pay any attention is another matter. See you next week, if you come back,
Open University.
Twirl around, shiny wet clay. Firm hands will shape it and make it a bowl